A billionaire CEO is surrounded by armed men in a rainstorm. Her bodyguards are frozen. Her security team is useless. Everyone is waiting for someone to act. Then a man in a faded flannel shirt steps out of a pickup truck. He has no weapon, no badge, no backup. He has a 6-year-old daughter watching from the back seat. And within 40 seconds, every attacker is on the ground. Nobody at that restaurant knew his name. Nobody knew his past. But after tonight, nobody in that city would ever forget the quiet father who moved like a ghost and hit like a verdict. If you've never seen this channel before, welcome. Hit subscribe right now because we put out stories like this every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. While you're at it, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The storm came in fast that Friday, the way late autumn storms always do along the Oregon coast. No warning, just a sudden drop in pressure, and then the sky cracking open like something had been holding it together with wire and finally gave up. By 6:30, rain was hammering the streets of downtown Portland in sheets, and the lights along the waterfront blurred into long orange smears on the wet pavement. Nathan Cross sat in his pickup truck in the parking garage beneath Archer's, the kind of restaurant where the valet stand had a small brass awning and the menu didn't list prices. He'd been sitting there for 4 minutes, engine off, working up whatever a 37-year-old man works up before walking into a place like that in a flannel shirt. Sophie had picked it. That was the thing. He told her she could choose anywhere in the city for her celebration dinner. She'd gotten a perfect score on her reading assessment, her second in a row, and her teacher had sent home a note that used the word remarkable twice. And Sophie had pointed to the photograph in a magazine she'd found at the dentist's office, some glossy spread about Portland's dining scene, and said, "That one, Daddy, the one with the candles." He'd tried to talk her into the barbecue place on Morrison. She wouldn't budge. "You look nervous," Sophie said from the back seat. She was 6, with her mother's dark eyes, and the particular brand of directness that made her sound, sometimes, like she was 45. "I'm not nervous." "Your jaw is doing the thing." "What thing?" "The tight thing, like when you're thinking too hard." Nathan turned around and looked at his daughter. She was already unbuckling herself, her patent leather shoes that he'd polished that morning catching the dim light from the garage ceiling. He'd bought the shoes 2 weeks ago, on sale, half a size big because she was growing faster than he could track. She was wearing the green dress that had been her mother's favorite. Claire had picked it out the Christmas before she died, when Sophie was barely 2, and Nathan had kept it folded in tissue paper in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed until Sophie finally grew into it. He hadn't been able to tell her that. He'd just said it was a special dress. "I'm fine," he said. "Come on, it's raining." They ran from the garage to the entrance, Sophie shrieking and laughing with her jacket pulled up over her head, Nathan's flannel shirt soaked through by the time the doorman pulled open the heavy glass door, and they stumbled into the warmth and the noise and the amber light of the dining room. Archer's was everything the photograph had promised. High ceilings with dark wood beams, white tablecloths, candles and small votives that threw soft light across the faces of the people eating there. Couples leaning toward each other, business dinners with tablets propped at the edge of the table, a birthday party in the corner with flowers Sophie immediately pointed at. The hostess looked at Nathan, then at Sophie, then at Nathan's flannel shirt. There was a pause, brief, practiced, before she assembled her smile. "Reservation," she said. "Cross. 7 o'clock. She found it. He'd called 3 days ago. He'd asked if there was a dress code, and the woman who answered had said, "Smart casual is recommended," and he'd stood in front of his closet for 10 minutes after that, before deciding the flannel was the cleanest thing he owned that wasn't a t-shirt. They were seated near the back, which was fine with him. He preferred walls behind him. Old habit he'd never bothered to argue himself out of. Sophie sat across from him and immediately picked up the menu, holding it with both hands, head tilted back to read the words she knew and studying the ones she didn't. She mouthed them quietly to herself. Nathan watched her and felt something settle in his chest that he couldn't name. Not quite pride, not quite grief, something that lived right between the two. "What's duck confit?" she asked. "Duck. Cooked slow in its own fat." She made a face. "That sounds wrong. It tastes better than it sounds. Can I get the pasta?" "You can get whatever you want." She put the menu down and folded her hands on the table the way she'd seen adults do, very deliberately, and looked at him with an expression of great seriousness. "Daddy, Sophie, thank you for bringing me somewhere nice." He felt the thing in his chest again. "You earned it." She nodded, accepting this as factual rather than sentimental, which was exactly what he'd intended. Their server came. Young woman, maybe 22, with a name tag that said Emily and the kind of quietly exhausted face that meant she'd been on her feet since lunch. She greeted them with genuine warmth, not the performed kind, but the kind people offer when they're tired and still trying. And she smiled at Sophie the way people smile at children when children remind them of something good. Nathan ordered the salmon because it was the second cheapest entree on the menu, and he wasn't going to let Sophie know he'd looked for that. Sophie ordered the penne arrabbiata, and after a moment of consideration, the chocolate lava cake for dessert, which she announced preemptively so there would be no confusion later about whether she'd saved room. Emily laughed, the real kind. "Good call," Emily said. "The lava cake is actually worth it here." "My daddy says sometimes expensive things are worth it, and sometimes they're just expensive," Sophie said. Emily glanced at Nathan. He shrugged. "He's not wrong," Emily said, and went to put in their order. It was in that first quiet stretch, bread on the table, Sophie tearing off pieces and examining them with scientific interest, that Nathan noticed the man 3 tables over. He noticed him the way he noticed most things in public spaces, not with any conscious decision to look, but because a part of his brain that hadn't been turned off in 13 years of civilian life was still cataloging rooms when he walked into them, still sorting people into categories of interest without asking his permission. Richard Vaughn was the kind of man who announced his presence through the reaction of everyone around him. I was somewhere between 55 and 60, built thick through the shoulders, wearing a suit that cost more than Nathan's truck, and he was holding court at a table of 4. Business associates, from the look of them, the kind of men who nod too quickly and laugh a half beat after the boss laughs. He wasn't doing anything yet. He was just loud. Loud in the specific way of men who've been told their whole lives that their loudness was actually confidence. His laugh carried across the room. His gestures were wide. When he told a story, his hands moved like he was conducting something. Nathan looked away. Not his business. He broke off a piece of bread and passed it to Sophie. 2 tables in the other direction, Victoria Ashcroft was having the kind of dinner she'd been having for the past 3 years. Functional, strategic, and quietly draining. She was 30 years old, which she was aware was younger than most of the men at her table by roughly 2 decades. And she'd learned a long time ago to say very little until she was certain of the room. She had the particular stillness of people who are always being watched and have made peace with it. Not comfortable exactly, but accustomed. She sat with her back straight and her wine glass touched but rarely lifted, and her eyes moving in small, controlled arcs across the dining room, while Marcus Hale, her VP of Business Development, walked Gerald Ferris and his 2 partners through the Q4 infrastructure projections. Gerald Ferris was 71, a venture capital elder statesman who'd made his money in early telecommunications and spent the last 15 years placing bets on technology companies that other investors called too ambitious. He'd called Ashcroft Technologies too ambitious 3 years ago, then changed his mind, and now he wanted a larger stake before the public offering. Victoria was deciding how much she wanted to give him. She liked Gerald well enough. He was direct, he didn't condescend, and he had the unusual quality of actually listening when other people spoke, which in her experience was rarer in wealthy men than anyone wanted to admit. She was half listening to Marcus's presentation and half watching the room. Again, habit, the permanent half attention of someone who learned early that rooms tell you things if you watch them right. When she noticed the man and the little girl in the back corner. The little girl was animated, talking with her hands, telling her father something that required a great deal of physical illustration. The father was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, which was not the posture of someone who'd grown up eating at places like Archer's. And he was listening to his daughter the way very few people listen to anyone, completely, without a corner of his attention elsewhere. He looked tired in the particular way that people are tired after years rather than after days. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself even while relaxed, like a structure designed to absorb weight. She couldn't have said why she kept looking at him. She looked away. Marcus was asking Gerald a question about timeline. Victoria refocused. Emily was coming out of the kitchen with an appetizer tray when it happened. She was moving along the narrow path between tables. The room was busy enough that the path between Richard Vaughn's table and the one beside it was tight, maybe 18 inches. And she was watching the tray, watching her footing, doing the small, careful mathematics of a full dining room on a Friday night. Richard Vaughn's leg extended into the path. It happened fast. Maybe it was an accident. For about 1 second, you could tell yourself that. Then you saw his face. He was watching her. He was smiling at whatever his associate had just said, but his eyes were on her, and they stayed on her as she hit his extended foot and went down. The tray went sideways. One plate shattered. A water glass rolled off a nearby table. Emily hit the floor hard on one knee and both palms, and the sound of it, the crash, the gasp that moved through the nearest tables, was the specific sound of a room deciding, in that fraction of a second, what kind of room it was going to be. Vaughn looked down at her. His expression didn't change much. "Jesus," he said, loudly enough to carry. "Watch where you're going." Emily was already trying to get up, her face red, gathering pieces of the broken plate with hands that were shaking. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. Let me just—" "This is the kind of service we're paying for?" Vaughn said, to no one in particular, to everyone. His associates made small sounds of agreement. A manager was moving toward them from across the room, but moving carefully, tentatively, the way you move when you're not sure yet what the math of the situation is. Then Vaughn leaned down and grabbed Emily's wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, maybe, hard enough to stop her. He pulled her upright with the casual authority of a man who had never in his adult life been told not to touch someone. "Look at this," he said. "Look at this mess." The room had gone quiet. Not fully, not the way rooms go quiet in movies. Conversations continued at other tables. The kitchen still made noise. But in the immediate vicinity, in the constellation of tables that could see what was happening, people had found things to look at that weren't Emily's face. Victoria had put her wine glass down. She was about to say something. She'd opened her mouth, she was formulating it, when she noticed that the man in the flannel shirt had already folded his napkin. He did it very deliberately, folded it in half, then quarters, and placed it beside his plate with a kind of finality. Then he stood up. He said something quiet to the little girl. The little girl nodded seriously and pulled her chair slightly back from the table and sat up straight, as though she understood that her father needed to not worry about her for the next few minutes. Nathan walked to Vaughn's table. He didn't move quickly. He didn't draw attention to himself until he was standing directly beside Vaughn, at which point there wasn't any way to not notice him. Not because he was large, though he was solid, built in the understated way of someone who used his body rather than displayed it, but because he'd positioned himself in the specific way that leaves a person no comfortable direction to look, except at him. "Hey," Nathan said. That was all. One word, quiet, no performance in it. Vaughn looked up. His expression cycled through several things quickly. Surprise, assessment, and then the decision that whatever this was, it could be dismissed. "Mind your own business, friend." "Let her go," Nathan said. Not a suggestion, not a request. It was the tone of someone who'd said versions of this sentence in places where the consequences of it not working were considerably more serious than a restaurant confrontation, and the certainty of that history was in every syllable. Vaughn released Emily's wrist. Then, because he couldn't let it be that simple, because there were 4 associates watching, and this was a man in a flannel shirt in a restaurant he couldn't afford, he pushed his chair back and stood up. He was taller than Nathan by 2 inches and had 40 pounds on him, the thick kind that comes from decades of good eating and occasional golf. He stepped forward into Nathan's space the way men do when they're betting their size against the other person's nerve. "You have any idea who I am?" Vaughn said. "I don't need to," Nathan said. Vaughn put his hand on Nathan's shoulder, grabbed it. The squeeze was meant to communicate something: dominance, the fact of physical presence, the implicit promise of escalation. What happened in the next 4 seconds was something Victoria would try to describe to her assistant 3 days later, and fail, because there was no clean sequence to it. There was Vaughn's hand on Nathan's shoulder, and then there was Vaughn sitting back down in his chair. And between those 2 things was a series of movements so controlled and so quiet that the word altercation didn't apply, because an altercation requires 2 people to be fighting and only one person here was doing anything. Nathan hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply moved in a way that redirected Vaughn's weight and leverage against itself. And now Vaughn was seated, blinking, with one arm bent at an angle that was right at the edge of uncomfortable. Nathan leaned down slightly, not threatening, just closing the distance to conversation level. "Apologize to her," he said. The room was very quiet now. Vaughn's face was doing complicated things. Emily was standing to the side with her hands pressed together, watching the floor. "I'm waiting," Nathan said. "Not impatient, not angry, just waiting. The way a man waits who has learned that waiting is sometimes the most powerful thing in the room." Vaughn looked at his associates. They were fascinated by the table. "Fine," Vaughn said, through something that was not quite his teeth. He looked at Emily. "Sorry." It was not a good apology. It was the apology of a man who had never apologized to anyone he considered beneath him and didn't know what the sounds were supposed to sound like. But it was something. Nathan straightened up. He nodded at Emily, who was staring at him with an expression that was somewhere between relief and bewilderment. Then he walked back to his table and sat down and picked up his napkin and unfolded it again across his lap. Sophie was watching him. "Did you help her?" she said. "Yeah." "Is she okay?" "She will be." Sophie thought about this. Then she picked up her fork. Good, she said. Across the room, Victoria Ashcroft sat with her wineglass still untouched, watching the man in the flannel shirt cut a piece of bread for his daughter. Gerald Ferris cleared his throat. "Now," he said, "where were we?" But Victoria didn't answer immediately. She was watching the way the father leaned toward the little girl and said something that made her laugh. She was watching his hands, which were completely steady. She was thinking about the 4 seconds, the absolute economy of what she'd seen, the way he'd positioned himself and moved and spoken, all of it carrying the signature of something trained, something deeply practiced, something a person doesn't learn by accident. She had met a great many powerful men. She had been in rooms with senators and defense contractors and the kind of billionaires who kept security details. She knew what calculated presence looked like. She knew what the performance of authority looked like. This was neither of those things. This was the real version, the kind that doesn't need a room to validate it. "Victoria?" Marcus said. She turned back to the table. "Sorry," she said. "Gerald, I want to revisit the timeline on the Series D tranche. I think we've been too conservative." She reached for her wine. And across the room, a 6-year-old girl held up a piece of bread to show her father something she'd found remarkable about it, and her father looked at it with full, unhurried attention, as though nothing in the world required him elsewhere. Among the staff near the kitchen, whispers had already begun. Someone had recognized him. The whispers started near the hostess stand and moved through the restaurant the way whispers always do in confined spaces, not as a single wave, but as a series of small fires, each one lighting the next. Nathan heard his name before he fully registered that people were saying it. I was watching Sophie work her way through the penne arrabbiata with the focused dedication she brought to anything she decided was worth her attention, and he was trying to decide if he wanted to finish the salmon or if he'd lost his appetite somewhere between standing up and sitting back down, when the sound of it reached him. Cross. Nathan Cross. He set his fork down. Across the room, a man in his early 50s with silver-framed glasses was leaning toward the woman beside him, speaking behind his hand. The woman glanced toward Nathan's table with the quick, careful look of someone trying not to be caught looking. 2 tables beyond them, the same thing. A hushed exchange, eyes moving. Nathan had not been recognized in the city in 4 years. He'd been careful about that. Portland was large enough to disappear into if you kept your head down, if you stayed out of certain rooms, if you didn't give anyone a reason to look at you twice. He drove a truck that was paid off, but not impressive. He lived in a house in Northeast that needed a new roof and had a backyard Sophie used as a racetrack for the remote control car his brother-in-law had sent for her birthday. He coached youth soccer on Tuesday evenings and picked up Sophie from school at 3:15 and made dinner most nights, and that was the life. And it was enough, and it was his. He hadn't needed anyone to know who he used to be. He hadn't wanted it. "Daddy," Sophie said, "why is that man looking at you?" He followed her eyes. It was the manager, a man in his 40s with the particular expression of someone managing competing anxieties, standing at the edge of the dining room, looking at Nathan with something that was not quite recognition and not quite bewilderment, but something between the two. "Eat your pasta," Nathan said. I am eating my pasta, Sophie said. I'm also asking a question. I can do both. He almost smiled. Some people know who I am, from a long time ago. From the Navy? He told her the outline of it. Not the details. She was 6, and some of the details he would never tell anyone. But the outline. That he'd been in the military, that he'd done important work, that he'd left when she needed him more than the work did. She'd accepted this with the practical equanimity she brought to most information, filed it next to other known facts about her father, and moved on. Something like that, he said. Sophie considered this while chewing. Do you miss it? The honest answer was complicated enough that he wasn't going to try it in a restaurant. Sometimes, he said. Not the way I used to. She nodded, satisfied enough. She speared another piece of pasta. Nathan looked back at the room. At Vaughn's table, the conversation had resumed, but it was thinner now, the energy deflated, the associates more cautious with their laughter. Vaughn himself was eating with the focused aggression of a man working something out internally. His jaw moved in tight, deliberate arcs. He hadn't looked at Nathan again, which Nathan registered not as a good sign, but as the other kind. The kind that meant the calculation was still happening. Men like Vaughn didn't forget things that happened to them in public. They filed them. Nathan had seen it enough times to know the shape of what came next, though he told himself he might be wrong. He told himself he was out of practice reading rooms. He told himself he was a father having dinner with his daughter, and the salmon was actually good, and Sophie was going to get her lava cake, and they were going to drive home in the rain, and she was going to fall asleep in the back seat before they reached the bridge like she always did. And that was the night. He told himself that. He watched Vaughn signal for the check with a sharp snap of 2 fingers and kept eating. Victoria had been in enough boardrooms and enough negotiations to understand the architecture of power displays. She'd watched men posture and threaten and retreat and recalibrate. She'd done some of it herself, though her version looked different, quieter, more precise, deployed when necessary, and then put away. What she'd seen at Vaughn's table had no architecture to it. That was what kept pulling at her attention, even as she walked Gerald Ferris through the revised timeline and answered Marcus's follow-up questions and signed the preliminary letter of intent that Gerald's associate slid across the table at the end of the evening. There had been no architecture to it because the man in the flannel shirt hadn't been performing anything. That was the rarest thing she'd seen in years. She was pulling on her coat near the entrance while Marcus handled the car service logistics, and Gerald made his slow, deliberate goodbyes. He was a man who treated departures with the same seriousness he gave arrivals. When she heard the murmuring around her sharpen into something more specific, a woman near the coat check speaking to her companion, Nathan Cross, I'm telling you, James recognized him right away. The companion, the Nathan Cross from, yes, he lives here now apparently, has a daughter. Victoria had a good memory for names. It was one of the tools she'd cultivated because in her industry, forgetting a name was a form of disrespect you couldn't always afford. She ran Nathan Cross through what she knew, and it took about 4 seconds for the file to surface, because it was not a small file. She'd read about him once in a defense industry briefing that one of her security consultants had circulated. The briefing itself was about private security contracting and the emerging market for executive protection services, and Nathan Cross had appeared in it as a case study, the kind of operator who defined a category rather than filled it. 14 years in naval special warfare. 8 of those commanding classified direct action units in places the briefing referred to only by coordinates. Then the transition to the private sector, a company called Sentinel Group that built a reputation in 3 years as the most reliable executive protection firm in the Pacific Northwest. Clients that included 2 governors, 4 Fortune 500 CEOs, and a foreign minister who hadn't wanted anyone to know he was in the country. Then the accident, the wife. And then nothing. The company sold, the man gone, the public story ending on a date that lined up, Victoria now understood, with a little girl in a green dress who ordered pasta and asked questions while she chewed. She stood near the coat check and looked back into the dining room. Nathan Cross was signing his check. Sophie was industriously scraping the last traces of chocolate from the ramekin. He said something to her without looking up from the receipt. She laughed. Victoria had not felt genuinely surprised by a person in quite some time. She wasn't sure she would have called what she felt right now surprise exactly. It was something closer to recalibration. The awareness that a thing she thought she understood, a man, a moment, a room, was substantially larger than she'd initially estimated. Victoria, Marcus, at her elbow. Car's outside. Give me one more minute, she said. But outside, the rain had eased from its earlier fury into a steadier, colder fall, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply accumulates, turning surfaces dark and making the parking garage entrance gleam under the sodium lights. Richard Vaughn stood under the restaurant's small awning, his phone to his ear, and he was not speaking the way he spoke at dinner. At dinner, his voice had been expansive, theatrical, built for an audience. Now it was flat and compact, and it had the quality of a man issuing a decision rather than making a request. I don't care what it costs, he said. I want it done before she reaches the waterfront. The associate who'd come outside with him was examining the middle distance with great interest. Vaughn ended the call. He looked at the associate, a man named Dolan, who'd worked for him for 11 years and knew better than to ask questions in the specific tone of voice Vaughn was currently using. Go get the car, Vaughn said. Dolan went. Vaughn remained under the awning, looking at the rain, and his jaw was doing the same thing it had been doing all through the latter half of dinner, that tight, methodical working through of something. He wasn't used to being handled. He'd been touched in a way he hadn't consented to, controlled in a way that had been witnessed by people whose opinion of him was worth money, and the fact that the man who'd done it had then simply returned to his dinner, hadn't pressed it, hadn't made a speech, hadn't even looked particularly satisfied, made it worse somehow, because it meant the man hadn't needed to. It meant that for Nathan Cross, what had happened at that table was simply a thing he'd done and then finished doing. Vaughn was not the kind of man who absorbed that kind of experience and moved on. He was the kind of man who restored the balance of the ledger. The SUV materialized through the rain a moment later, and Vaughn got in without looking back at the restaurant, and the door closed, and the car pulled away. Emily was on her break at the far end of the kitchen corridor, sitting on an overturned milk crate with her phone face down in her lap, when the line cook, who everyone called Tomas, came around the corner and said, "Guy at table 14's asking for you." She looked up. "Which guy?" "The one in the flannel, with the kid." She hadn't expected that. She'd been thinking about her knee, which had hit the floor harder than she'd let herself acknowledge in the moment, and was now making its opinion known through the fabric of her work slacks. And she'd been thinking about what she was going to say to her mother when she got home. Her mother, who'd been asking for 3 weeks whether Emily had thought about looking for something else, something easier, something where the customers didn't. And she'd been deliberately not thinking about the scene in the dining room, because thinking about it made her hands start doing the thing they'd done right after, the trembling she'd managed to keep small enough that maybe no one noticed. She put her phone in her apron pocket and went back out. Nathan was standing near his table. Sophie had been helped into her coat and was now conducting some investigation of the votive candle on the table, poking at the wax with the handle of her dessert spoon in the meditative way of children who are being patient while adults do adult things. He had his wallet out, and he was holding something. "Hey," he said when Emily reached him. He held out a folded set of bills. "For the plate." Emily looked at the money. The plate had been a $10 appetizer, and she was responsible for breakage. She did not know how much was in his hand, but it was more than $10 by a significant margin. She could see that without counting. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't put it away. She took it. She would think later that it was the lack of ceremony in the gesture that made it possible. He wasn't making it into something, wasn't looking for gratitude, wasn't staging a moment. I was just a man paying for a plate that got broken in a situation that was his fault as much as anyone's, because he'd intervened and intervening had made things messier before it made them cleaner. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she needed to say it, and there wasn't a better way, for the other thing too. Nathan nodded. He looked like he was going to say something, reconsidered, and then said it anyway. "You do that kind of thing often?" "I don't know," Emily said. "I mean, not to me before tonight, but there have been other staff. He comes in a lot." She paused. "He's got accounts here. That's why the manager didn't—" She stopped. "Yeah," Nathan said. He said it in a way that didn't require her to finish the sentence. "There's not a lot of— people don't usually—" She stopped again. The sentence wasn't forming the way she wanted it to. "It's easier to look away," Nathan said. "Doesn't mean people are bad, just means it's easier." Emily thought about the room, the full restaurant, the the white tablecloths, the people who'd turned back to their meals. She told herself it was shock, that nobody had known what to do. Maybe that was part of it. Your daughter is really sweet, she said, because she needed the subject to change before she started crying in the dining room, which was not happening. Nathan glanced back at Sophie, who had graduated from poking the candle to building something architectural out of the sugar packets. She has her moments, he said, and there was something in it, the rough, unpolished affection of a man who wasn't good at talking about the things he loved most. Emily smiled. It felt like the first real smile she'd produced all evening. "Safe drive home," she said. He nodded again and went back to his table, and Sophie looked up from her construction project and said something to him that made him duck his head the way fathers do when they're trying not to let their kids see them smiling. The parking garage was not well lit on the lower level, and the sound of rain filtered down through the structure in a way that softened everything. Footsteps, voices, the mechanical hum of the elevator. Victoria walked with Marcus and one of her security detail, a man named Petrov, who'd been with her for 2 years, and she was talking through the revised projections with Marcus, because work expanded to fill whatever space was available, and right now the available space was a parking garage at 8:45 on a Friday night. The infrastructure build-out timeline needs to move 6 weeks if we're going to have anything to show Ferris by Q2, she said. That's going to require pulling the Singapore team back stateside, Marcus said. I know. Talk to Chen on Monday. See what the minimum disruption window looks like. They reached her SUV. Petrov moved ahead the way he always did, a practiced motion, quick scan of the vehicle and the immediate perimeter. He was good at his job in the specific way of people who are thorough rather than dramatic about it. He had the rear door open and Victoria was halfway to reaching for it when she heard the elevator. Or rather, what she heard was 3 sets of footsteps coming out of it, in a rhythm that was too coordinated to be coincidental, and then the sound of a van she hadn't noticed before starting its engine at the far end of the garage, and then Petrov saying, "Victoria," in a tone of voice he'd never used with her before. They came in fast. There were 4 of them, not running, not announcing anything, just moving with the purposeful speed of people who've done the calculation and decided it comes out in their favor. They wore the kind of dark, nondescript clothing that said not quite professional, but practiced enough. And 2 of them had their hands inside jacket pockets in the way that's meant to communicate something without having to demonstrate it. Petrov moved toward the nearest one, and then there were more of them, a 5th from the stairwell she hadn't seen, and the calculus changed in the 2 seconds it took her to process it. Marcus grabbed her arm, not roughly, just with the panicked grip of a man who isn't a security professional in a situation that required one, and said, "Get in the car, get in the car." But the van had pulled across the exit. Petrov was doing what he could, which was significant, but he was one man and there were 5 and this had been planned. She could see that in the spacing, the way they'd distributed themselves, the van already positioned, and for approximately 30 seconds, Victoria Ashcroft, who had navigated hostile boardrooms and aggressive acquisitions and 100 situations designed to make her feel small, felt genuinely afraid in a way that had nothing to do with professional stakes. Then she heard a pickup truck's door open. Nathan had been walking Sophie to the truck. They'd parked on level 2, 1 floor below the main structure, and he was holding her hand and she was stepping deliberately over each painted line in the lot, a game she'd invented that required concentration, when the sound reached him from below. The van engine. The specific cadence of multiple sets of feet moving together on concrete, a man's voice rising briefly and then cutting off. He stopped. Sophie looked up at him. "Daddy?" His hand tightened slightly on hers. He took in the geometry in about 4 seconds, the garage layout, the ramp, the structural pillars, the slope of the floor. He knew where the sounds were coming from relative to where they were standing. He crouched down to Sophie's level. "I need you to do something important for me," he said. She read his face the way she'd learned to, with the seriousness of a child who understood that not everything her father said required the same weight, and that when it did, she would know. "Okay," she said. "Go to that pillar right there." He pointed to the thick concrete column 8 feet away, close to the wall. "Sit with your back against it. Don't move. Don't come find me no matter what you hear. Wait until I come to you." "How long do I wait?" "Until I come. That's all. You understand?" She swallowed. She was 6, and she was scared, and she didn't fully pretend otherwise. But she nodded, and she walked to the pillar with the deliberateness of a child determined to do the right thing, and she sat with her back against it and pulled her coat around herself and looked at him. He looked back at her for exactly 1 second. Then he turned and went down the ramp. What happened in the lower level of that garage over the following 2 minutes was not elegant. Nobody who was there, Victoria, Marcus, Petrov, the 5 men Vaughn had sent, and Nathan Cross, would have described it as anything other than brutal and fast and ugly in the way that real physical confrontations are always ugly, nothing like the clean choreography of things designed for entertainment. Nathan came down the ramp fast but without sound, which was itself a kind of violence, the absence of warning, and he had a clear read of the situation in the time it took him to cross 12 feet of concrete because he'd done this kind of reading in conditions considerably less forgiving than a parking garage in Portland. He knew which bodies were threats and which were not. He knew Petrov was managing one attacker, and managing him well, and didn't need assistance. He knew Victoria was backed against the vehicle with Marcus between her and the nearest man, which meant Marcus was about to become a problem, which meant the sequence had to account for that. He didn't think about it. That was the thing people who hadn't done this always misunderstood. There wasn't time for thinking, and thinking wasn't the mechanism anyway. 14 years of training and execution had built something below the level of thought, a set of responses that ran faster and quieter than decision-making. His body knew things his conscious mind had to work to remember. The first man he reached was the one closest to Victoria's door, and Nathan came at him from an angle that the man hadn't covered in his positioning, a mistake that indicated practice without excellence. And the takedown was a matter of seconds, leveraged rather than forced, the kind that leaves a person on the ground and more or less uninjured but with a strong disinclination to get back up quickly. The second man turned in time to see his partner go down and didn't make a sound before Nathan was on him. The third had gotten past Marcus and had his hand on Victoria's arm. She'd turned into him, which was wrong tactically and right instinctively, making herself harder to move. And Nathan's arrival was a disruption significant enough that the man let go and tried to reorient and lost the window he'd had. The fourth and fifth were the ones who made it complicated. They'd spread wide, covering angles, and one of them got a hand on Nathan's jacket, and for about 8 seconds the situation was genuinely uncertain in the way that physical confrontations always become uncertain when numbers shift. It wasn't clean, it wasn't precise. Nathan took an elbow to the ear that rang through his skull and said something impolite under his breath. And then Petrov, who had finished with his man, crossed the garage in 5 seconds, and the math changed again, and within another 30 seconds, all 5 attackers were down or restrained against the van that could no longer leave because Petrov had the keys from someone's pocket. Nathan stood in the center of the garage with rain running off his jacket. The structure was open-sided on the lower level, and the rain came in at an angle. And his breathing was elevated and his ear was ringing, and he was thinking about Sophie, who was upstairs with her back against a pillar, waiting. Victoria was pressed against the side of her SUV. She wasn't hurt. Shaken in the way that takes time to work through, the delayed arrival of adrenaline and fear, and the strange clarity that sometimes follows a thing your nervous system hadn't prepared for. Marcus was to her left with a split lip from when the attacker had pushed past him, holding his face with one hand and looking at the men on the ground, with the expression of a person recalibrating several things at once. She looked at Nathan. He looked back at her briefly and said, "You hurt?" "No," she said. And then, because it was the only thing that accurately described the situation, "What just—" "Vaughn," Nathan said. It wasn't a question. She stared at him. "How do you—" "He made a phone call," Nathan said. "Outside. I didn't hear it, but I saw it. His posture changed." He said it simply, without emphasis, the way someone states a thing that was obvious to them at the time. Victoria processed this. The man in the flannel shirt at a dinner table with his daughter had been watching an angry billionaire make a phone call through the window of a restaurant and had correctly interpreted what it meant. "My daughter's upstairs," Nathan said. "I need to—" "Go," Victoria said. "We'll call the police. Go." He was already moving back toward the ramp. On. Sophie was exactly where he'd left her, back against the pillar, knees pulled up, watching the ramp with her dark eyes. When he came up the ramp and she saw him, something in her face released, a tension she'd been holding that she didn't quite have words for yet at 6 years old. He came to her and crouched down and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her. "You okay?" he said. "I waited," she said. I didn't move. I know. You did good. Are you okay? She was looking at the side of his head. Your ear is red. It's fine. It looks like it hurts. Ears are dramatic, he said. They make everything look worse than it is. Sophie studied him. She had her mother's way of looking at a thing until she decided she'd seen enough of it to be satisfied. Okay, she finally said. He helped her up. He could hear sirens now, distant but closing, moving through the wet streets toward the garage. He held Sophie's hand and they stood at the top of the ramp while the blue and red light began to paint the walls below, and Sophie leaned against his side and he put his arm around her and they waited. Daddy? Sophie said. Yeah. Is the lady okay, the one from inside? He looked down at her. Yeah, he said. She's okay. Sophie nodded, satisfied. Down below he could hear Victoria's voice, steady and composed, talking to the first officer on the scene. He could hear Petrov giving the location of the van, the number of individuals, the timeline. He could hear Marcus, whose voice had not yet recovered its usual register, and further away, receding. He would learn the rest of it from the news the following morning. A black SUV registered to Richard Vaughn's property management company had been stopped 3 blocks from the garage, and Vaughn himself had been in it, and the phone in his jacket pocket had a call log that told the next 12 hours of the story with complete clarity. Nathan stood in the parking garage with his daughter leaning against him and his ear ringing and his flannel shirt soaked through from the rain, and he was tired in the deep, specific way that always followed the return of old instincts, not from the effort, but from the remembering of what it cost to carry those instincts, the weight of being the person who knows how to do those things when other people don't. Sophie slipped her hand into his jacket pocket the way she did when she was cold, a habit she'd had since she was 3, and her small fingers curled around his thumb. He stood there and let her. The police were there for 2 hours. Nathan sat on the rear bumper of a patrol car with Sophie asleep against his shoulder. She'd lasted through the first 40 minutes of questions and statements and the strange, busy machinery of law enforcement processing a scene, and then her head had tipped sideways and her breathing had changed, and she was simply gone, the way young children go under, completely and without negotiation. He'd adjusted his arms so she wouldn't fall and kept answering questions with the half of his attention that wasn't occupied by the weight of her against his side. Detective Laura Okafor was in her mid-40s, short hair, a raincoat that had seen better years, and she had the particular quality of good investigators. She let silences sit without filling them, and she watched the space around a person's answers as much as the answers themselves. She'd come on scene 40 minutes in, after the first responders had sorted the physical situation, and she'd pulled Nathan aside with the patient authority of someone who already had most of the shape of the evening and needed the details filled in. You were in the restaurant, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. You witnessed the incident with the victim, the waitress, and the suspect Vaughn. Emily, Nathan said. Her name's Emily. Okafor made a note. And you intervened. I asked him to let her go. He didn't. So I helped him sit down. Okafor looked at him over the rim of her notepad. Helped him sit down. Nobody got hurt, Nathan said. That was the point. She studied him for a moment. She'd been briefed on who he was. One of the first responders had recognized his name from the incident report and flagged it, and Okafor had pulled enough background in the preceding 20 minutes to have a working picture. She was too professional to make anything visible of it, but he could see the small recalibration happening behind her eyes. The 5 individuals in the garage, she said. Can you walk me through the sequence? He did. He kept it factual and short, which she seemed to appreciate. He told her about the phone call he'd observed Vaughn making outside the restaurant, the posture, the flat voice, the way the man's whole bearing had changed from humiliated to resolved. He told her what he'd heard from the top of the ramp. He told her what he'd done and in what order, and he told her that Petrov had assisted, and that Victoria Ashcroft had not been touched. You determined none of the individuals were armed? One of them had something in his jacket pocket, Nathan said. He used it to communicate threat but didn't produce it. When I reached him, it was a folding knife, not a firearm. He paused. Petrov secured it. You assessed all of this in a few seconds, Nathan said. Yeah. Okafor wrote something down. She had a way of writing that didn't interrupt the conversation, the pen moving almost separately from the rest of her attention. Mr. Cross, you understand I'm going to need you available for follow-up. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She glanced at Sophie, who had not moved. The girl is your daughter. Sophie, she's 6. Something shifted briefly in Okafor's expression. Not softness exactly, but acknowledgement of a fact that the paperwork didn't fully capture. She doing all right? She'll be better in the morning, Nathan said. She's tougher than she looks. Seems like she had a good teacher, Okafor said, and then closed her notepad before he could respond to it. On the other side of the garage, Victoria was finishing her own statement. Nathan could see her from where he sat. She was standing without leaning on anything, which he noticed because most people, after what she'd been through, would have found something to lean on. Her posture was the kind that doesn't come from composure so much as from stubbornness, from a practiced refusal to let her body communicate things she didn't want communicated. She was answering questions in a clear, measured voice, and the officer taking her statement kept having to ask her to slow down because she was giving him more precise detail than his notepad could keep up with. Marcus had been taken to get his lip looked at. It wasn't serious, but it had swollen enough that a paramedic had insisted, and he stood now near the ambulance with an ice pack and the shell-shocked expression of a man whose Friday evening had not gone according to any plan he'd ever prepared for. Petrov stood near the van, which was still blocking the exit, talking to 2 officers with the relaxed competence of someone who had done this kind of debrief before. He'd taken one of the attacker's wrists at an angle that had resulted in a fracture. He'd reported it himself, before anyone asked, matter-of-factly, as a relevant piece of information rather than a confession. The 5 men were in 2 patrol cars. Vaughn himself, Nathan had learned, was in a 3rd car 3 blocks away, still in his suit, reportedly having said nothing beyond requesting his attorney. Nathan shifted Sophie's weight slightly and looked at the ceiling of the garage structure. Concrete and water stains and the orange amber of the sodium lights. The rain was still coming in at the edges, and it made a sound like static, like the space between radio stations. He was thinking about Claire. He didn't mean to. He never meant to, in moments like this, the messy aftermath moments, the adrenaline-worn moments. But she arrived anyway, the way she always did. Not as a ghost or a presence, but as a measurement. He'd found himself doing that in the years since her death, measuring things against her. Would she have been frightened tonight or exhilarated? She'd been both of those things, often at the same time. She'd had a laugh that came out when she was scared, genuine and slightly too loud, and she'd been embarrassed by it, and he'd loved it unreasonably. She would have had 7 questions for Okafor, and she would have made Marcus feel better about his lip, and she would have wanted to know every detail about the 5 men, who hired them, how they were recruited, what they were getting paid, not out of fear, but out of the specific curiosity that had made her one of the best investigative reporters at her magazine before she'd left to raise Sophie. He looked down at Sophie's sleeping face, her eyelashes against her cheek, the slight open-mouth breathing of deep sleep. You did good tonight, he thought, both of them. He wasn't sure which one he was talking to. Victoria found him there 20 minutes after Okafor had moved on to other interviews. She came around the side of the patrol car and stopped a few feet away. And when he looked up, she was standing with her arms folded. Not defensively, more like she was cold. And her hair was wet from the rain that came in sideways on this level. How's your ear? She said. He touched it reflexively, still tender. Fine. She looked at Sophie. She's been asleep this whole time? She holds it together and then she's just done. She gets that from her mother. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I want to thank you, she said. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because you stopped something that... She paused. Because you saw it coming before I did, and you acted on it, and I'm the one who has a security team, and you're the one who had a 6-year-old and a dinner to get home from. She said it in a way that made clear she'd been sitting with this fact for the past hour and found it something between humbling and infuriating. Nathan didn't say anything. Petrov is very good, she said. He's been with me 2 years. He's thorough, he's professional, he doesn't miss things. And he missed this. Vaughn made the call outside, Nathan said. If Petrov was inside or at the vehicle, he wouldn't have seen the posture change. You were inside, she said. Old habits, he said. I wasn't looking for it specifically. He stopped. It's just how I sit in rooms. She looked at him directly, and he got the impression that she was accustomed to reading people and to making quick assessments, and that she was doing both right now, and that the assessment was taking longer than she expected. "I know who you are," she said. "I knew about an hour before the garage. I figured. I'd read about the Sentinel Group years ago in a security briefing." "Old history," he said. "Maybe," she said. "It doesn't look very old from where I'm standing." He looked at Sophie. He shifted his arms slightly, and Sophie made a small sound of protest without waking, then resettled. "I'm sorry about your wife," Victoria said. She said it simply, without the usual freight of such statements. Not reaching for anything, not making it a bridge to something else. Just putting it there. He wasn't prepared for the simplicity of it. He nodded, once. "She would have been good at tonight," he said, and then was mildly surprised at himself for saying it, because he didn't usually do that with strangers. Victoria tilted her head slightly. She understood somehow not to ask what he meant, which itself was unusual. "Yeah?" she said. "Yeah." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Rain on concrete, police radio, the particular quiet of a situation that has resolved itself and left everyone slightly stunned in its wake. "The girl's name is Sophie," Victoria said. "How did you know that?" "The officer told me, when I asked." Nathan looked at her. "You asked." "I wanted to make sure she was—" Victoria stopped. Something crossed her face that might have been embarrassment, which struck him as genuine. "I wanted to make sure she was okay," she said. "She sat against a pillar in a parking garage by herself in the dark because her father asked her to, and I wanted to make sure someone had checked." He held that for a moment. "She's okay," he said. "Good," Victoria said. And then she unfolded her arms and reached into her coat pocket and produced a business card, which she held out to him with the directness of someone who has made a decision and is acting on it without ceremony. "I'm going to want to talk to you, not tonight, but in the next few days." He took the card. "About what?" "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Several things, probably." She looked at him steadily. "I hope that's not a problem." He turned the card over. Ashcroft Technologies. Her name and a direct number. No title. "It's not a problem," he said. She nodded. She looked at Sophie one more time, not intrusively, more the way a person looks at a thing that has reminded them of something they didn't know they'd forgotten, and then she said goodnight and walked back toward Marcus and the SUV that a tow truck was helping extract from the van's blocking position. The news broke at 11:30 that night, and by morning it was on every local outlet and had found its way onto 3 national ones. The narrative assembled itself from the pieces that were publicly available. Wealthy developer Richard Vaughn arrested on charges including conspiracy, assault, and orchestrating what investigators were calling a targeted abduction attempt on the CEO of Ashcroft Technologies. The 5 men in custody. The waitress. And here, Emily's name entered the story in a way she hadn't anticipated and hadn't been asked about, which would require its own reckoning. The waitress with the bruised wrist who'd been grabbed in front of a full restaurant. The security footage from Archer's own cameras, which had captured the dining room incident with more clarity than anyone realized footage could have. And Nathan Cross, described variously as a decorated former Navy SEAL and mysterious former security executive, and in one cable segment, with great enthusiasm, as a one-man rescue operation, which made him close the laptop and not open it again until the afternoon. Sophie found out about the news coverage the way children find out about most things, through a combination of overheard adult conversation and the particular antenna children have for information adults are trying to keep from them. Nathan was on the phone with his brother-in-law, David, who'd called from Seattle at 7 in the morning with the tight voice of someone who'd already been sitting on news for 3 hours and hadn't slept, and Sophie had come downstairs in her pajamas and her hair at various angles and looked at the open laptop on the kitchen counter with the instinct of a child who understands screens. "Sophie," Nathan said, still on the phone. "Don't—" She'd already seen enough. He finished the call quickly and came into the kitchen, and she was sitting at the counter looking at the closed laptop with the careful face she made when she was thinking about something she wasn't sure how to say. "There was a thing on the computer," she said. "Yeah." "About last night." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "It said you used to have a company." "I did." "You never told me that." "You never asked," he said, and then corrected it. "I mean, you were little. It didn't seem like something you needed to know about yet." Sophie absorbed this. She had a way of processing information that looked from the outside like she'd shut down, but he'd learned over 6 years that she was most active in those still moments, cataloging, cross-referencing, arriving at a conclusion that would surface in her own time. "The lady from the restaurant," she said. "Is she on the news too?" "Victoria. Yeah, there's some stuff about her. Is she okay?" "She's fine." Sophie pulled at a loose thread on the hem of her pajama sleeve. "She seemed sad," she said. "Last night, when she was talking to you. She seemed like she was sad underneath." Nathan looked at his daughter. Sometimes the clarity she produced felt like a physical thing, something with weight. "Yeah," he said. "I think maybe she was." Sophie considered this. "People who are sad underneath are usually nice," she said, with the philosophical certainty of 6-year-olds who have not yet been disproven. "That's not always true," Nathan said. "It's mostly true," she said. He poured her a glass of orange juice and put it in front of her. She picked it up and drank half of it in one go, which was how she drank everything, fully committed. "Dad," she said. "What?" "You're on the news." "I noticed. Are you in trouble?" "No," he said. "The opposite." She seemed to find this adequately satisfying. She climbed down from the counter stool and went to find her cereal, navigating the kitchen with the proprietary confidence of a child who had been the primary occupant of this house her entire life. Emily saw it differently. She'd been awake at 6:15 when her phone started. First her mother, then her coworker Diane, then 3 numbers she didn't recognize, and she'd sat in her apartment on the edge of her bed with the phone buzzing in her hand and watched the notification count climb with the slow, disoriented feeling of someone standing in a room that has been rearranged while they slept. Her manager at Archer's called at 8. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he had, in Emily's 2 years working there, said approximately 4 words to her directly in any context that wasn't work-related. And now he was on the phone using her first name twice in the opening sentence. "Emily, I want you to know that we're fully behind you," he said. "The restaurant stands completely behind our staff." Emily held the phone slightly away from her ear. "Mr. Fitch." "Gerald, please." "Gerald," she said, and the word sat strangely in her mouth. "Last night, when it was happening, when he grabbed my wrist, you were walking toward us." Silence. "And then you stopped," she said. "And then you walked the other way." More silence. She heard him breath. "I want to make that right," he said. "I know you do," she said, "because it's on camera and it's on the news." This was not perhaps what the human resources professional who was surely listening on the other end of this call had hoped she would say. But it was what she said, and she felt afterward the complicated mixture of satisfaction and anxiety that comes from saying true things to people who have power over your income. He assured her she wasn't in any trouble. He assured her there would be changes. He said the word policy 4 times. He said they'd have a proper conversation early next week, and that her shifts were fully available if she wanted them, and that he was personally sorry for what had happened. She thanked him and hung up and sat for a while looking at the wall. She thought about Nathan Cross, who'd folded his napkin and stood up in a restaurant full of people who'd found other things to look at. And she thought about the folded bills he'd handed her. She'd counted them in the kitchen, $500 for a $10 plate. And she thought about what he'd said. "It's easier to look away. Doesn't mean people are bad. Just means it's easier." She'd been looking away for 2 years. Not from any single dramatic incident. Nothing like last night had happened before, at least not to her, but from the accumulated texture of the place. The way certain customers spoke to the staff. The way Fitch's face arranged itself when a complaint came in from a table that spent enough money. The way she'd learned, slowly and without noticing she was learning it, to make herself smaller, more invisible, more accommodating. She picked up her phone again and scrolled to a contact she'd saved 8 months ago and never used. The name said Portland Workers' Rights Clinic. She'd taken the number off a pamphlet in the break room at a previous job, kept it the way people keep emergency numbers they hope they'll never need. She sat for a moment. Then she pressed call. The investigation moved faster than Nathan expected, which told him the physical evidence was cleaner than Vaughn's attorney was probably hoping. By Saturday evening, investigators had corroborated the restaurant footage with Vaughn's call records. The outgoing call at 8:12 p.m. to a number linked to a man with 2 prior assault charges who was now in custody. and had recovered correspondence on one of the other men's phones that detailed the operational approach in enough specificity that it removed most of the interpretive ambiguity from the situation. Detective Okafor called Nathan Saturday afternoon. She was more informal on the phone than she'd been in the garage, which he took as a measure of how the case was developing. Vaughn's attorney is arguing the call was to discuss a property matter, she said. How's that going? Nathan said. About as well as you'd expect, given that the man he called has a criminal record and doesn't appear in any of Vaughn's business filings. She paused. Vaughn had a previous complaint on file, harassment of staff at a restaurant in the Pearl District 18 months ago. Didn't go anywhere. Because he had accounts there, Nathan said. That's a reasonable interpretation, Okafor said. Mr. Cross, I'm going to need you in on Monday to give a formal statement. Is morning workable? I'll need to arrange something for my daughter. We can do afternoon. 2 o'clock, he said. 2 o'clock. And Mr. Cross. She paused again in the particular way that told him she was about to say something outside the scope of the official call. The footage from the restaurant, the part at Vaughn's table. The DA's office is very interested in it. Okay, he said. A lot of people looked away, she said. You're the only one on camera who stood up. Another pause. I just thought you'd want to know that. He thanked her and ended the call and stood in his kitchen listening to Sophie in the backyard, running some elaborate game that involved the remote control car, several plastic animals, and what sounded like a fairly complex system of rules that she was narrating to herself in a running monologue. He'd been trying, since last night, to locate something in himself that felt like the old restlessness, the pull toward action, toward consequence, toward the kind of work he used to do. He'd felt it briefly in the garage, the activation of something that had been dormant, and he'd been watching for it to linger, to make its case. It hadn't. He'd stood in that garage and done what the moment required and then come back up the ramp to his daughter, and the thing that had felt most important in the aftermath, the weight that mattered, was her fingers curling around his thumb in the dark. He didn't know if that made him a different person than he used to be, or just an older one. Victoria called on Sunday. He almost didn't answer. The number wasn't in his phone, and he'd had enough calls from unknown numbers in the preceding 36 hours to have developed a specific reluctance. But something made him pick up on the fourth ring. It's Victoria Ashcroft, she said. I hope this isn't a bad time. He was sitting on the back steps watching Sophie construct something in the corner of the yard with sticks and the clay-heavy soil that never quite dried out in November. It's fine, he said. I want to make you an offer, she said. I've been thinking about it since Friday night, and I want to be straightforward with you because I get the impression you prefer that. I do, he said. I want you to lead security for Ashcroft Technologies. Global operations. You design the program from the ground up, your specifications, your team selections. The compensation would be, I want to be clear that I'm not going to lowball you and waste both our time. She named a number. It was, in fact, not lowballing. He watched Sophie press a stick into the soil with great intentionality. How long have you been working on that pitch? He said. A short pause. Since Saturday morning. It's a good offer, he said. I know. Victoria, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name, and he was aware of it, and he thought she might have been too. I'm going to say no. Silence. Then, can I ask why? He watched Sophie. She'd found a flat piece of bark and was using it as some kind of architectural element in whatever she was building. Her tongue was slightly out the way it got when she was focused. I already have the job that matters most, he said. He'd expected the silence that followed to be the silence of a person recalibrating their approach, preparing the counteroffer. It wasn't that. It was something else, shorter and softer, in a way he hadn't anticipated from her. That's a good answer, she said. It's the true one, he said. She was quiet for another moment. And then, in a different register, less executive, less composed, something that sounded more like a person talking rather than a professional making contact. Is she doing okay? Sophie? He glanced at the yard. Sophie had now recruited the remote control car into whatever project she was running, parking it carefully beside her stick construction with the absorbed seriousness of an architect inspecting a site. She's building something, he said. I don't know what it is yet, but it's got a car in it. He heard something on the other end of the line that might have been a laugh. Quiet, almost involuntary, the kind that escapes before a person decides to let it. That's a good sign, she said. Usually, he said. Victoria said she'd be in touch about the formal statement process. She thanked him again, briefly this time, without ceremony, and ended the call. Nathan put his phone in his pocket and went down the steps into the yard and crouched beside Sophie's construction, which turned out to be, she explained with great specificity, a parking garage for woodland creatures who needed somewhere safe to leave their vehicles during difficult weather. He looked at it. The flat bark was the roof. The sticks were the support columns. The remote control car was, apparently, there as a demonstration of scale. You did this because of last night, he said. Sophie looked at him with an expression that suggested the question was slightly beneath her. I made it safe, she said, so nobody gets scared in the parking part. He looked at his daughter's small hands, soil darkened, pressing another column into the ground with total conviction. Yeah, he said, that's a good idea. She handed him a stick without being asked, with the natural authority of someone delegating an assistant, and he took it and pressed it into the clay where she pointed, and they worked in the gray November light while the yard smelled like rain-wet soil and the distant sound of traffic moved through the trees at the fence line, and for a while nothing required anything of either of them except this. The statement took 3 hours. Nathan sat across from Okafor and an assistant DA named Reyes in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Justice Center, a building he'd been in twice before in his life under entirely different circumstances, and he answered everything they asked with the same economy he'd used on Friday night. No elaboration beyond what was requested, no editorializing, the facts arranged in the sequence they'd occurred. Reyes had the habit of asking the same question 2 different ways, separated by other questions, which Nathan recognized as a technique for checking consistency. He answered both versions identically, because the answers were identical, which seemed to mildly frustrate Reyes and mildly satisfy Okafor. David had driven down from Seattle Sunday night to stay with Sophie during the statement, which meant Nathan came home to his brother-in-law in the kitchen, making something that involved every pan Nathan owned, and Sophie sitting on the counter providing unsolicited culinary direction. You can't put that much garlic in, Sophie was saying when Nathan came through the door. You absolutely can, David said. More garlic is always the answer. That's not true. Dad puts in 2 cloves. You put in 7. Your dad puts in 2 cloves because he has no sense of adventure. Sophie looked at Nathan. He put in 7 cloves, Dad. I can smell that from here, Nathan said. David turned around, wooden spoon in hand, wearing an apron that had been Claire's, bright yellow, with a pattern of small lemons, absurd on his 6'2" frame, and grinned the way he'd been grinning at Nathan since they were in their 20s, that particular grin that contained both affection and the awareness of exactly how much he could get away with. Statement go okay? Fine, Nathan said. You look like a man who spent 3 hours answering lawyer questions. That's what I did. David turned back to the stove. Pasta's in 20 minutes. Go change your clothes. You look like you're still in the military. Nathan looked down at himself. He was wearing the same flannel shirt, which was, objectively, not a military look, but David had a specific version of logic that didn't always map onto observable reality. He left them to it and went upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed for a few minutes in the quiet of a house that had noise in it, which was different from quiet in an empty house, better in ways he didn't often let himself acknowledge. He changed his shirt. He sat another minute. Then he went back down. At dinner, Sophie told David about the stick-and-bark parking garage in the backyard with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone unveiling a significant engineering achievement, and David listened with the complete, unironic seriousness he always brought to Sophie's projects, asking questions about structural integrity and drainage and whether the woodland creatures had a ticketing system. Nathan ate the pasta, which had too much garlic and was very good, and listened to his daughter talk, and felt some of the fluorescent tightness of the Justice Center conference room work itself out of his shoulders. The lady called again, Sophie said. Nathan looked up from his plate. What lady? The one from the restaurant, Victoria. She said the name with the matter-of-fact familiarity of someone who'd been running it through her head often enough that it had become ordinary. She called your phone, but you were gone, so I answered. There was a pause at the table. Sophie, Nathan said, measuring his words carefully. You answered my phone. You always say to answer if it's a number I don't know, in case it's important. That's for emergencies. When I'm not... He stopped. What did she say? She said she was calling to see how you did at the statement. I told her you were at the lawyer place, and she said, okay, tell him I hope it went well, and I said, it probably went fine because you're very hard to rattle. Sophie speared a piece of pasta. She laughed. She laughed, Nathan said. It was a nice laugh, Sophie said. Not a fake one. You can tell the difference. David was looking at Nathan with an expression of great interest and very carefully not saying anything, which for David required visible effort. Did she say anything else? Nathan said. She said her name was Victoria, in case I didn't know, which I already knew because you told me. Sophie paused. I told her my name was Sophie. She said she knew that too. Nathan set his fork down. He picked it back up. He was aware of David still performing his heroic silence across the table. Okay, Nathan said. She seemed nice, Sophie said. Sad underneath, like I said, but nice. David lasted about 4 more seconds. Who, he said, is Victoria? Nobody, Nathan said. The lady from the restaurant, Sophie said simultaneously. David looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at David. They had in 6 years developed a small, efficient alliance against Nathan's conversational minimalism. Tell me about the lady from the restaurant, David said. She's a CEO, Sophie said. She's on the news. Dad saved her from bad men in the parking place. The parking... David turned to Nathan. You saved a CEO from bad men in a parking garage, and you led with, it went fine. The statement went fine, Nathan said. That was the question. Nathan James Cross. Don't. You are the most... David made a sound that wasn't a word and turned back to Sophie. Is she pretty? David, Nathan said. She has good hair, Sophie said with the authority of someone who considered hair a legitimate metric. And she was wearing a nice coat. A nice coat, David said. Nathan. A woman with good hair and a nice coat called your personal cell phone to see how you were doing. She called about the statement. It was professional. She called to make sure you didn't get chewed up by lawyers, David said. That's not professional. That's personal. Nathan looked at him. David looked back. The lemon apron between them, Claire's apron, which David had simply put on when he found it on its hook and hadn't commented on, and neither had Nathan. Eat your pasta, Nathan said. David smiled. Smaller this time, quieter, less ammunition in it. Yeah, he said. Okay. The week after was strange in the specific way of weeks that follow extraordinary events, where ordinary life resumes but sits slightly crooked on its frame. Nathan coached soccer Tuesday evening. He picked Sophie up from school. He fixed the gutter on the north side of the house that had been pulling away from the fascia board since August, standing on a ladder in 40-degree weather with a caulk gun, while the neighbor's dog watched him from across the fence with philosophical patience. The news cycle moved quickly. It always did. But the Vaughn case had enough salacious architecture to hold attention longer than most. A wealthy developer, a targeted abduction attempt on a tech CEO, a former Navy SEAL who'd intervened twice in the same evening. The cable segments ran their compressed versions of it. A newspaper did a longer piece that got some of the facts right and invented a few it found more useful. Nathan's name appeared in headlines for 4 days before other events pulled the bandwidth elsewhere. He didn't watch most of it. He didn't have the stomach for the version of himself that existed in those reports. The vocabulary they reached for, the adjectives, the implicit narrative of the lone hero, which was both reductive and wrong in ways he couldn't have explained quickly enough to matter. What actually happened was that he'd been in a room and seen something and done something about it. That was all. The fact that he'd been trained to see those things and equipped to do something about them didn't make it heroic. It just made it less unusual than it looked to people who hadn't been trained that way. He'd said something close to this to Okafor on the phone, Wednesday morning when she called with an update on Vaughn's arraignment. You know the restaurant staff are talking about you, she said. I've heard, he said. Emily filed a formal complaint. She's got a lawyer now. And apparently there are 11 other current and former Archer's employees who've come forward with their own incidents involving Vaughn. He sat with that for a moment. 11. He's a regular at 4 high-end restaurants in the metro area. The pattern is consistent. She paused. Emily's lawyer says she reached out after seeing the footage. The camera footage of you standing up. She said, and I'm quoting here, that she'd been telling herself for 2 years that she wasn't the kind of person who made trouble, and watching someone else decide to stand up made her realize that wasn't who she actually was. Nathan didn't say anything. "I thought you'd want to know that," Okafor said, "since you seem to be a man who doesn't particularly enjoy being told when he's done something right." "I'm working on it," he said. She made a sound that might have been amusement. "Vaughn's attorney is going to try for bail reduction next week. I'd expect it to fail given the flight risk assessment, but I wanted you to know the shape of things." He thanked her and went back to the gutter, which was still leaking at the northwest corner despite his best efforts, and stood at the top of the ladder in the gray November cold and thought about 11 people who'd been looking away for 2 years and then stopped. Victoria came to the house on Thursday. She'd called Wednesday evening, Nathan's phone this time, not Sophie's, and asked if she could stop by. She said she had some documents from Okafor's office that were easier to go over in person, which was partially true and both of them knew it. He'd said yes, and she'd said 10 in the morning, and they'd ended the call with the slightly careful efficiency of two people who are aware they're navigating something they haven't fully named yet. Sophie had school. Nathan cleaned the kitchen, which needed it regardless of company, and left the rest of the house in its normal state, which was organized in the specific way of a man and a 6-year-old living together. Functional, slightly improvised, with evidence of Sophie everywhere. A drawing on the refrigerator. A pair of small rain boots by the front door. A construction paper mobile hanging in the kitchen window that Sophie had made at school and insisted represented a solar system, though the planets were different colors than their actual counterparts, and 2 of them appeared to have faces. Victoria arrived at 10:03 in a car that was considerably more expensive than anything on his block, wearing jeans and a dark sweater under her coat, which was not the coat from Friday night. That had been a formal occasion coat, structured and deliberate. This was simpler, the kind of thing a person wears when they're not dressing for an impression. He noticed this and filed it without deciding what to do with it. "Nice house," she said on the porch. "It needs a new roof," he said. "Well," she said, "nice street." He let her in. She looked at the house the way she'd looked at him at dinner. Not appraisingly, more like she was locating herself in relation to things, building a map. She looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, a large figure and a small figure holding hands with a dog between them, though they didn't have a dog. She looked at the solar system mobile with its faced planets. She didn't comment on any of it, but he saw her looking, and he didn't mind it the way he thought he might. He made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the documents from Okafor's office, and they went through them, and it was genuinely useful to go through them in person. There were 2 sections where her account and Nathan's intersected in ways that needed to be consistent, and having both people in the room made the clarification straightforward. She'd done this kind of thing before, he could tell. She read quickly, caught the things that mattered, didn't get snagged on the things that didn't. They were 40 minutes in when she put the papers down and looked at him across the kitchen table. "Can I ask you something that isn't about the case?" she said. "Depends on the question," he said. "Fair," she said. "When did you sell the Sentinel Group?" He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. 4 years and 3 months ago. You remember the months. I remember the date, he said. Down to the hour. She held that. Because of your wife. Sophie needed someone steady, he said. The business wasn't compatible with steady. I made a choice. Do you regret it? He considered the question, which deserved consideration rather than a reflexive answer. Not the choice, he said. Some days I miss. Not the work exactly. The structure of it. Knowing what the day requires. That specific kind of purpose. He paused. Sophie gives me that. Different version of it. She's remarkable, Victoria said. I say that based on a phone call and 40 minutes in a parking garage. She's 6, he said. She still cries when a cartoon character gets hurt. She's not remarkable. She's just herself. I'm trying to let her be that before the world starts wanting her to be something else. Victoria looked at the solar system mobile. One of the faced planets was slowly rotating in the heat from the window, its paper smile turning toward them and then away. I used to be like that, she said. A kid who was just herself. She said it without self-pity, more the way someone reads a fact off a distant sign. Somewhere in the first company I stopped. I don't know exactly when, it's a gradual thing. How old were you, the first company? 23, she said. It was a disaster. I learned more from it than from any of the things that worked. How many companies? 3 before Ashcroft. None of them made it past the third year. She said it without apology. People think I got here because I'm smart. Smart is the part that's completely table stakes. What actually worked was being wrong enough times that I stopped being afraid of being wrong. Nathan looked at her. She was doing the things she'd done at the restaurant. The absolute stillness, the looking at things directly. He'd thought then that it was a professional habit. He was revising that. It was just how she was. Your offer was a good one, he said. The security position. I know, she said. I wasn't lying about the terms. I know you weren't. He set down his mug. If I'd said yes, what would you have thought of me? She considered it. I'd have thought you were very good at the job and probably not quite right. She paused. A man who leaves that career because his daughter needs him and then takes a corporate security job 6 years later for a generous salary doesn't quite add up internally. The math is off. And a man who says no adds up, she said. Unfortunately for my security program. You'll find someone good, he said. I've already started looking, she said. That's not why I'm here. He waited. I'm here, she said, because I've spent 4 days being looked at by people who want something from the situation. The investors want reassurance. The board wants a statement about operational security protocols. The media wants a quote. My attorney wants me to say nothing. Petrov wants to review every procedural failure. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. And you're the only person involved in Friday night who hasn't wanted anything from it, including credit. I have a daughter, he said. I had a reason to make sure you got out of that garage. You would have done it anyway. He didn't argue with that. I'm not good at this part, she said. Which part? The asking for things that aren't professional. She was watching the mobile again. I'm genuinely good at my job. I'm not particularly good at the other things. I know that about myself. She looked back at him. I'd like to know you. And Sophie, if that's... She stopped and rearranged the sentence. I recognize I'm not being very elegant about this. You're being clear, he said. That's better than elegant. A pause. Okay, he said. Victoria looked at him. Okay? Sophie's got a soccer game Saturday. It's cold and the field has bad drainage, so it's usually muddy by halftime. He picked up his coffee. You're welcome to come. Something happened in her face. Small. Not the assembled expression she wore in public, but something underneath it. The shift of a person receiving something they'd been careful not to want too specifically. Yeah, she said. Wear boots, he said. Not the nice coat. Emily's formal complaint was filed on the Wednesday of that week, and the law clinic that had taken her case, a young attorney named Priya, who had the organized ferocity of someone determined to make herself consequential, had been thorough in ways Emily hadn't anticipated. The complaint was not simply about Friday night. It cataloged 18 months of documented incidents across 4 restaurants, cross-referenced with the accounts of 11 other staff members who'd come forward, and included correspondence recovered from Vaughn's email by investigators operating under the broader warrant from the garage case. The restaurant association that governed Archer's and 3 of the other establishments in Vaughn's orbit had issued a statement by Friday morning. The statement was not as specific as Priya would have liked, but it acknowledged the complaints, committed to policy review, and used the word unacceptable in a way that had enough legal weight to matter. Gerald Fitch called again on Friday afternoon. Emily let it go to voicemail and listened to it sitting in Priya's waiting room. He'd made a decision. He wanted her to know before she heard it from anyone else. Effective the 1st of December, Emily would be promoted to training supervisor, a salaried position, benefits, responsibility for onboarding and workplace culture initiatives across Archer's staff. He said it was a decision that reflected her quality of work over 2 years, which they both knew was partially true. And he said it was also a decision that reflected the restaurant's commitment to the kind of workplace they should have been building already, which was entirely true and more honest than she'd expected from him. She sat in the waiting room and played the voicemail again and felt a complicated swell of things. Vacation, exhaustion, the specific ache of something you fought for landing differently than you imagined it would. She'd thought she'd feel more triumphant. What she actually felt was tired and something like relieved, which was softer than triumph, but probably more durable. Priya came to the waiting room door. You ready? Yeah, Emily said. She put her phone away. Can I ask you something? Sure. Does it always feel like this afterward? Like it worked, but she searched for the word. Priya leaned against the door frame. She was 29 and had been doing this for 2 years and had the kind of face that had seen enough of these conversations to know where they went. Like you're not sure if you feel better or just different, she said. Yeah, Emily said. Always, Priya said. It's because you spent a long time carrying something and now it weighs different. Your body hasn't caught up yet. Emily nodded. Give it a week, Priya said. Come on, we've got a lot to cover. Nathan was in the backyard Saturday morning, raking the wet leaves that had accumulated against the fence, when Sophie came out in her soccer uniform with her shin guards already on but her cleats in her hand. She sat on the back steps and started putting the cleats on with the concentrated effort they required. They were slightly too big, bought with growing room, and the lacing took both hands and all her attention. Is she coming? Sophie said. Victoria? Yeah. Sophie continued lacing. I told Mia that a lady was coming to my game. She paused. Mia said, is she your dad's girlfriend? I said, I don't know. Is she? Nathan set the rake against the fence. No, he said. She's a friend. Sophie looked up. Mia's mom said you probably need a friend. He came and sat on the steps beside her. He looked at the half-laced cleat. Here, he said, and she let him take her foot and he finished lacing it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been doing this for 3 years. Dad, Sophie said. What? It's okay if she becomes a friend. She said it in the tone of someone clarifying a policy that should have been obvious. I like her. She has a real laugh. He tied off the second cleat and looked at his daughter, who was looking back at him with the particular patience of a child who has decided she is waiting for an adult to catch up to something she already understands. When did you get so smart? He said. I get it from you, she said, and from Mom. She stood up and tested the cleats on the step, bouncing on her toes. Mostly Mom, Mia's mom says. She says I have my mom's eyes. You do, he said. Sophie absorbed this with the quiet gravity she sometimes showed when Claire came into the conversation, not sadness exactly, more the careful handling of something precious. She'd never had the chance to know her mother well enough to grieve her specifically, only abstractly, and Nathan had watched her build a Claire out of photographs and the stories he and David and Claire's parents told. A composite person who was both real and constructed, real enough to matter. She would have liked Victoria, Sophie said. I think. He didn't answer right away. He stayed on the step and thought about Claire's laugh that came out when she was scared, and her 7 questions for strangers, and the way she'd been made of more curiosity than caution. Yeah, he said, I think she would have too. Sophie patted his arm once, 2 quick pats, the gesture she used when she'd decided a thing was settled and they could move on, and went down into the yard to practice with her ball. Victoria arrived at 10:15 in a car. She parked herself at the curb, wearing boots as instructed and a dark green jacket that looked warm rather than decorative. She came around the side of the house because Nathan had texted her the gate code, and Sophie looked up from her ball practice and said, very directly, Good. You came, which was not a greeting exactly, but contained a greeting inside it. Victoria smiled. The real kind, as Sophie had noted. Hi, Sophie. I'm warming up, Sophie said. You can watch, and I'd like that, Victoria said. She came and stood beside Nathan, and for a moment neither of them said anything, watching Sophie execute an elaborate series of kicks and pivots that were part practice and part performance. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of Pacific Northwest November day that arrives like an apology for the week of rain, and the light came through the bare trees at the fence line in long, pale bars across the grass. You don't have to do anything, Nathan said. Today. Just come to the game and drink bad coffee from the concession stand. That's the whole offer. The whole offer, she said. The field's muddy. You mentioned. He glanced at her. She was watching Sophie, who had graduated to some kind of elaborate drill that required her to talk to herself. Victoria's face had the unguarded quality it got when she wasn't aware of being observed, the one he'd first noticed at the restaurant, looking at him across the room. Open, in the way that some people are open when they finally stop managing. Thank you for coming, he said. She looked at him. Thank you for asking, she said. Sophie looked up from the ball. Okay, she said. We should go. I like to get there early and look at the field. Why? Victoria said. Sophie considered this with great seriousness. To know where the mud is, she said, so you can use it. Victoria looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Victoria. She's got a point, he said. Sophie was already heading for the gate, ball under her arm, the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who knows where she's going. Nathan picked up the soccer bag from the steps and followed, and Victoria fell into step beside him, and the three of them went out through the gate and down the wet sidewalk in the pale November light. Sophie slightly ahead, narrating something to herself about field conditions and strategy, her cleats making small, precise sounds on the pavement. The morning held all of them, ordinary and sufficient, and quietly full of the kind of possibility that doesn't announce itself but accumulates, the way good things do, in the small, unremarkable hours of ordinary days. Sophie's team lost the game 4-2, which Sophie accepted with the philosophical resignation of someone who had identified the structural problems early and made her peace with the outcome before the final whistle. Jalen kept passing to the wrong side, she explained to Victoria on the walk back to the car, in the tone of someone delivering a post-mortem analysis rather than a complaint. I told him at halftime. He kept doing it anyway. Did you tell him nicely? Victoria said. Sophie considered this with genuine effort. I told him accurately, she said. Victoria looked at Nathan over Sophie's head. He gave her the slight raise of one eyebrow that meant, this is a recurring issue and we are managing it. Sometimes accurately and nicely have to be the same thing, Victoria said, especially when you need the other person to actually change what they're doing. Sophie walked in silence for a moment, her cleats leaving small half-moon prints in the muddy grass at the field's edge. Did someone teach you that? She said. I learned it the hard way, Victoria said. I was very accurate for a long time and wondered why people kept not listening. Sophie absorbed this with the seriousness she brought to most things that struck her as genuinely useful information. Okay, she said. Then, I got mud on my shin guard. I saw, Nathan said. It's a lot of mud. It is. I used it, though. Like I said, in the second half on the left side of the box. The mud was good for the cut move because Jalen's defender slipped. I saw that, Victoria said. That was really smart. Sophie looked up at her, checking for the performance of a compliment versus the real thing. She seemed to find it real. She nodded once and kept walking, satisfied, and slipped her muddy hand into Victoria's without any preamble or announcement, the way young children do when they've decided a person is trustworthy. Not as a request, simply as a fact. Victoria looked down at their joined hands. She didn't say anything. She just kept walking, and her grip adjusted to fit Sophie's, and Nathan watched this from one step behind and felt something in his chest move in the way that things move when you weren't prepared for them. They stopped at the coffee stand on the way out of the park. Sophie got hot chocolate with both hands wrapped around the cup, declaring it the best hot chocolate she'd ever had, which Nathan suspected she said about most hot chocolates, but which she appeared to mean each time. They stood at the edge of the parking lot in the cold morning light, the three of them, and didn't say much. And the not saying much was easy in the particular way that easy silences are, the kind that have nothing awkward left in them. This was November. By February, some things had become ordinary that hadn't been before sound. Victoria came on Saturdays. That was how it started, and then it wasn't just Saturdays. She came on a Wednesday evening in December because Nathan was fixing the kitchen faucet, which had developed an opinion about its own operation, and Sophie had called her, on Nathan's phone, which Sophie had quietly annexed as a communication device for this specific purpose, to report the plumbing situation and inquire whether Victoria knew anything about faucets. Victoria did not know anything about faucets, but she came anyway and sat at the kitchen table watching Nathan underneath the sink with a flashlight, while Sophie provided commentary and they ordered Thai food when it became clear the faucet was going to require a part that had to be ordered, and tonight was a loss. She came on a Sunday in January because Sophie asked her to help with a school project about animal migration patterns, and Victoria had stayed 3 hours, and the project had evolved from a simple poster into a laminated index document that Sophie's teacher sent home with a note that said, "Exceptional Initiative," and included a small gold star sticker that Sophie added to the growing collection on her bedroom doorframe. You made that project significantly more complicated than it needed to be, Nathan told Victoria afterward, in the kitchen while Sophie was in the bath. She wanted it to be complicated, Victoria said without apology. She had opinions about the Pacific Flyway that needed space to breathe. She's 6. She's 6 and she had structural opinions about migratory data presentation. Victoria sipped her coffee. I wasn't going to tell her to scale back. Nathan looked at her across the counter. You're going to be a problem, he said. Probably, she said. The thing between them developed the way real things develop. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of unremarkable ones. The Wednesday faucets and Sunday projects. The time she stayed for dinner because Sophie asked and neither Nathan nor Victoria manufactured a reason she should leave. The evening in January when Sophie fell asleep on the couch between them during a movie and they sat in the quiet of the house with his daughter's feet across their laps and talked in low voices for 2 hours about things that were neither professional nor strategic. His brother-in-law's bad cooking and her first apartment at 21, which had a window that didn't close fully, so she'd slept in a sleeping bag for 6 months rather than ask the landlord to fix it, which she attributed to stubbornness, and he said sounded like pride, and she said the difference was smaller than he thought. She told him, in February, over coffee at the kitchen table while Sophie was at school, about her parents. Her father had built small things, furniture, repairs, the particular patient craft of someone who understood how objects worked and what they needed. Her mother had run the administrative office of an elementary school for 30 years, with a competence so complete that the school had functioned less efficiently for the first 3 years after she retired. They'd both been proud of Victoria in the specific way of people who understand they've produced something they don't fully recognize but know is good. They'd worried about her in the quieter, specific way of people who watch their child choose a life that doesn't leave much room for the things they consider essential. Warmth, rest, the unhurried companionship of people who love you. They weren't wrong to worry, she said. She wasn't looking for sympathy in it. She was just saying a true thing. Are they still... Nathan said. My mother is. My dad died 4 years ago. She said it without the rehearsed quality it sometimes had when people said those words. Not over it. Nothing is over it. Just having carried it long enough that the weight was known. He would have liked you. He had no patience for performance. He could tell in about 30 seconds whether someone was the real version of themselves or the managed version. Which version does your mother like? Nathan said. Victoria looked at him. Then she smiled, reluctantly, the way she smiled when something caught her unprepared. She'd like this version, she said. She's been asking me for years to find this version. Nathan filled her coffee without being asked, which was something he'd started doing without noticing, and she accepted it the same way. Richard Vaughn's trial was scheduled for March. In the interim, the civil suits had multiplied. Emily's case had consolidated with 4 others, and Priya's office had expanded to a team of 3 to manage the workload. The prosecutors had added charges as the investigation deepened, uncovering 2 prior incidents in other cities that had been settled quietly under non-disclosure agreements that no longer had quite the legal protection Vaughn's previous attorneys had promised they would. Vaughn's properties had begun their own unraveling. 3 business partners had withdrawn. 2 banks had reviewed their exposure and found reasons to recall loans. The architectural and legal infrastructure of his empire had been built on the assumption that he would always be the most powerful person in any room he entered, and it had not been built for the contingency where that stopped being true. Nathan testified in the preliminary hearing in January. He sat in the witness box and answered questions the same way he'd answered Okafor's and Reyes, directly, without embellishment, the facts in their sequence. Vaughn's attorney tried twice to use Nathan's military background as a rhetorical instrument, implying that what had happened at the restaurant table was disproportionate force from a trained operator rather than a reasonable intervention by a civilian. Nathan answered both attempts the same way. The physical contact had been brief, controlled, and had not injured anyone, and the only person it had ended was a man who'd grabbed someone's wrist in public. The attorney moved on. Emily testified the following week. Priya had prepared her thoroughly, but preparation only does so much for the experience of sitting in a room and describing, in specific clinical language, the accumulated texture of something that had happened to you over time. Not one dramatic incident, but the slow drip of it, which is harder to articulate and easier for people to discount. Emily had spent 2 weeks building the language for it, and she sat in that box and used it clearly and without faltering. And when Vaughn's attorney tried the condescension routine on her, the slight elevation in register, the implication of exaggeration, she met it with the particular steadiness of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had decided they were done. Nathan was in the courtroom that day, which he hadn't told her he would be. She saw him when she came out of the box. He was 3 rows back, sitting with the same economy of presence he brought everywhere, and he nodded once when she looked at him. She nodded back. That was all. She didn't need more than that, and the fact that he understood this was its own specific kind of support. Afterward, in the corridor, she stopped beside him. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "How was it?" She meant her testimony. She needed an honest read. "Clear," he said. "Specific. You didn't let him pull you anywhere you didn't want to go." "I wanted to tell him to go to hell twice," she said. "3 times, actually," he said. "But you didn't. That was the right call." She laughed, the genuine kind, which she hadn't expected to do in a courthouse hallway. "You were counting." "Old habit," he said. "Situational awareness." She went back to Priya's office, and Nathan went home to pick up Sophie from school, and the February light came through the courthouse windows in thin, pale bars across the marble floor, cold and insufficient, and somehow enough. The sentencing came in late April, by which point spring had arrived in Portland the way it always does, tentatively, with setbacks, 2 warm days followed by a week of rain, and then one morning you open the back door and something smells different, and you know the balance has shifted. Vaughn received 32 months on the conspiracy and assault charges, with the civil cases still pending and likely to strip what the criminal proceedings hadn't. His attorney issued a statement about appeal. The statement had less conviction in it than the attorneys usually managed. Emily had a different kind of morning. She'd been in the training supervisor position for 5 months by then, and the work had surprised her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected to find it satisfying in the straightforward way that forward movement is satisfying. What she'd found instead was that she was genuinely good at it. Not just adequate or functional, but the kind of good that comes from having been through the things she was now teaching people to navigate. She knew what it felt like to look away. She knew what it cost. She could talk to a 22-year-old server who was trying to articulate why a certain table made them uncomfortable and give them language they didn't have yet, because she'd spent 2 years not having it herself. Fitch was different with her now, not dramatically. He was still himself, still managing upward pressure and downward expectations, still more comfortable with the ledger than with the room. But he'd stopped walking toward things and then away from them. He'd come to her twice with situations that required someone to be clear and direct, and he'd let her handle them, which was its own form of acknowledgement, even if he never made it explicit. On the morning the verdict came in, she was running an onboarding session in the back room, 3 new hires, first week. She stopped partway through and told them what had happened and why it mattered to this restaurant specifically. One of the new hires, a young man named Tobias, who was working his first serving job, listened and then said, "What do you do if it happens and the manager isn't nearby?" "You handle what's in front of you," Emily said. "And then you come find me. I'll handle the rest." She paused. "And if you're not sure whether something is worth reporting, it is. The bar is low intentionally. I'd rather hear about 9 things that turned out to be nothing than miss the one that mattered." Tobias nodded. He wrote something in the small notebook he'd been taking notes in, which Emily found she respected. After the session, she stood in the back corridor where she'd sat on the milk crate that Friday night, and she thought about what it had taken to get from that crate to this room. Not a straight line. Nothing like a straight line. More like the route you take through a city when you're not sure of the way. You overshoot, you double back, you find yourself somewhere useful you hadn't planned to be. She thought about the man in the flannel shirt who'd folded his napkin, and she thought that the most important thing he'd done wasn't the 4 seconds at Vaughn's table or the 2 minutes in the garage. The most important thing he'd done was show her, clearly and without explanation, that standing up was a decision available to her, that it had always been available, that she'd been choosing every time she'd looked away, and that she could choose differently. You can do that without knowing you've done it. You can change the geometry of someone else's life by simply acting as if a thing that is possible is actually possible. She went back to her office. She had 3 more sessions that day. Sophie turned 7 in May, and they had the party in the backyard on a day that finally, fully felt like spring. David drove down from Seattle and spent 2 days executing an elaborate cake he'd found in a cookbook, which required more equipment than Nathan's kitchen possessed, and resulted in a cake that looked substantially different from the photograph, but tasted, by unanimous verdict, better. Sophie's four closest friends from school occupied the yard with the compressed, intense energy of children given space and sugar, and Nathan stood at the edge of it watching the organized chaos with the equanimity of a man who had long since made peace with the noise level that 7-year-olds produce when gathered in multiples. Victoria came with flowers, which she'd clearly deliberated over because they were the right kind. Not roses, not the formal celebratory flowers, but a bunch of bright ranunculus in orange and yellow that she'd gotten from the farmer's market that morning. Sophie took them with both hands and held them like a small ceremonial object and said, with tremendous gravity, "These are my favorite kind," which Nathan was reasonably certain she was inventing on the spot, but which she appeared to commit to completely. "How do you know they're your favorite?" Victoria said. "Have you had ranunculus before?" Sophie examined the flowers. "I know because they look exactly how a flower should look," she said, "but more so." Victoria looked at Nathan. He shrugged. "She's been like this since she could talk," he said. The afternoon moved through its phases, the games, the cake, the particular velocity of children's parties which seemed to occupy both too much and too little time simultaneously. David organized a relay race that devolved cheerfully into something nobody could explain. Nathan fixed the wobbly leg on the picnic table that had been wobbly since September. Victoria sat with Sophie and helped her open presents with the focused generosity of someone who understood that this was Sophie's afternoon and her role was to be present in it rather than manage it. When the friends had been collected by their parents and the yard had been cleared to the degree it was going to be cleared that evening, David took the cake debris inside and made unnecessary noise with the dishes in the way he did when he was giving Nathan space. The sky had gone the particular pale gold of Pacific Northwest evenings in late May, long and slow, the light reluctant to leave. Sophie was sitting on the back steps in her party dress, shoes off, examining one of her presents, a small illustrated atlas of the world that her teacher had given her, filled with maps and animal distributions and geographical facts. She'd been at it for 20 minutes with the same absorption she brought to things that genuinely interested her. Victoria sat beside her on the steps. Nathan was on the bench against the fence, close enough to hear. Sophie turned a page. "Did you know," she said, "that there are more than 10,000 species of birds?" "I didn't know the exact number," Victoria said. "Lyrebirds can imitate almost any sound," Sophie said, "including machines." She looked up. "Imagine being able to sound like anything." "What would you sound like?" Victoria said. Sophie thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "The rain," she said, "the Portland kind. Not the stormy kind, the regular kind." She paused. "What would you sound like?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. Nathan watched her think about it. The real consideration, not the quick social answer. "Something steady," she said finally. "I used to want to sound impressive. Now I think I'd rather sound steady." Sophie nodded, satisfied. She went back to her atlas. She turned 2 more pages, read something, turned back. "Victoria," she said. "Yeah." "You smile a lot more when you're with Dad." The yard held the sentence. Nathan looked at the fence. Victoria looked at Sophie, who was already looking back at her atlas with the matter-of-fact expression of someone who has said a true thing and sees no reason to elaborate. "Yeah?" Victoria said. Her voice was careful, not in a guarded way, but in the way of someone holding something they don't want to drop. "Yeah," Sophie said. "I notice things." She turned a page. "Dad smiles more too. He thinks I don't notice, but I do." Nathan said from the bench, "Sophie." "It's true," Sophie said to the atlas. Victoria turned and looked at Nathan across the yard. The gold light was doing what it does in late May, making ordinary things look considered, the fence boards and the bare soil of Sophie's garden patch, and the man sitting on the bench in his faded jacket, with his hands folded and his expression doing something it didn't usually do in public. He looked back at her. There were things neither of them said in that moment, which was fine. There would be time for the saying of things. That was the thing about what had built between them. It had been built slowly enough that it was solid, built in kitchens and sidelines and courthouse corridors and backyard afternoons, built in the unremarkable hours rather than the dramatic ones. It didn't need announcement. It was already there. Sophie closed her atlas. "I'm going to go ask Uncle David if I can have more cake," she said. "Absolutely not," Nathan said. "I'm going to ask anyway," she said pleasantly, and went inside. Victoria laughed. The real one, the involuntary one, the one that came out before she decided to let it. Nathan stood up from the bench and came and sat beside her on the steps, and they stayed there while the light finished what it was doing with the sky, slow and unhurried. "She's something," Victoria said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You did that." "Claire did most of it," he said. "The part that matters. I'm mostly maintaining the infrastructure." "You're underestimating yourself," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Probably." The screen door opened and Sophie appeared with a small plate of cake, which she presented to Victoria with ceremony before settling herself between them on the step, fitting herself into the space between two adults the way children do when they've decided they belong there, which Sophie had decided some time ago. Inside, David was making more noise than the dishes strictly required, because David understood that some moments needed the space of the people not in them, and subtlety had never been his strength, but the intent was always right. In June, the three of them went to Archer's. It hadn't been planned specifically. Nathan and Victoria were on their way back from taking Sophie to see an exhibition of wildlife photography at the art museum downtown. Sophie had stood longest in front of a photograph of a lyrebird, which she'd found vindicating, and they were hungry, and Sophie said, "Can we go to the candle restaurant?" with the casual authority of a child who sees no reason why a place that was complicated once should be complicated now. Nathan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Nathan. "Yeah," he said. "Why not?" Emily was on shift. She saw them from across the room the way she now saw most things in that dining room. Not anxiously, not with the particular self-consciousnness of the person who has learned to make herself small, but with the simple awareness of someone who knows the room and its people. She crossed to their table and said hello, and Sophie immediately said, "We came back," as if this required documentation. "I see that," Emily said. She looked at Nathan. "How are you?" "Good," he said, and then, because it was true and she deserved to hear it, "How are you?" "Better," she said. "Actually better. Not just saying it." He nodded. She looked at the three of them at the table. Sophie already deliberating between the penne and something new, Victoria reading the menu with the focused attention she brought to documents, Nathan in his flannel shirt, which was, as always, the least expensive thing in this room. She thought about the Friday in November when she'd come out of the kitchen corridor with a tray and a restaurant full of people who'd found other things to look at, and she thought about what she'd said to Tobias in the onboarding session. The bar is low intentionally. "I'd rather hear about 9 things that turned out to be nothing than miss the one that mattered." She thought about all of it, and she felt, standing at this table on this ordinary June evening, something she would have had trouble naming precisely. Not gratitude, not exactly, something more structural than that. The sense that a thing had changed, and the change was permanent, and it had started with a man folding his napkin. "Can I get you something to drink?" she said. "Water for me," Nathan said. "Hot chocolate," Sophie said. "It's June," Nathan said. "I know," Sophie said. Emily smiled. "We have it," she said. We kept it on the menu." Sophie looked at her father with the expression of a person whose position has been vindicated by objective circumstance. Nathan looked at the ceiling briefly. "Water and a hot chocolate," he said. "I'll take sparkling water," Victoria said. She'd put down the menu. "And we'll need another minute on the food." Emily wrote it down and went, and the table settled into itself the way tables do when the people at them have been through things together and don't need to perform their comfort with each other. Sophie was explaining to Victoria the structural difference between 2 items on the menu with the authority of someone who has eaten here before and considers this expertise. Victoria listened and asked a clarifying question about the pasta sauce, and Sophie answered it with confidence, and Nathan watched the candlelight on the table and listened to them talk and felt the evening hold all of them. It wasn't the same restaurant it had been in November, or maybe it was the same and they were different, which amounts to the same thing in the end. The world has a way of showing you its worst and its best in close proximity. One Friday night, it offers you a man who trips a woman carrying a tray and reaches for her wrist in front of a full room, and it offers you a room of people looking away. And it offers you the understanding that looking away is easier than not. Not because people are bad, but because habit is deep and the cost of interruption feels, until you pay it, higher than it is. And then the same night gives you a 6-year-old girl sitting with her back against a concrete pillar in the dark because her father asked her to wait, and she waits, and he comes back because that is the deal they have. The fundamental, unwritten, everything deal of the people who choose each other. The world is full of people making calculations about what the moment costs and whether they can afford it. Most of the time, the answer is yes. Most of the time, the thing we told ourselves was too expensive was within reach the whole time. We just needed to see someone else pick it up first. Nathan didn't think of himself as someone who'd taught anything to anyone. He was a man who'd sat in a restaurant with his daughter and seen something and done something about it. And he'd done it the same way he did everything that mattered to him, without announcement, without waiting to see how the room would respond, without thinking about how it would look from the outside. He'd done it because it was in front of him, and it was the right thing, and he was capable of it, and that was enough reason. That was all. That was the whole of it. Sophie got the penne arrabbiata again. Victoria ordered the salmon, which Nathan looked at and then ordered too, and Sophie pointed this out immediately as evidence of something she declined to specify but filed for later. The hot chocolate came and Sophie wrapped both hands around it and declared it the best she'd ever had, which she meant completely, which she would mean again the next time. They ate dinner in the restaurant where everything had started, and the candles were the same, and the white tablecloths were the same, and the rain was starting again outside, soft against the windows. The regular Portland kind. Not the stormy kind, the regular kind, steady and sufficient. Sophie had asked Victoria once in the Atlas conversation what she would sound like if she could sound like anything. Victoria had said something steady. Nathan thought, watching the three of them reflected faintly in the dark window beside their table. His daughter, this woman, himself, the improbable geometry of how they'd arrived at the same table. That steady was underrated. Steady wasn't dramatic. Steady didn't make the news. Steady was the thing that showed up on Tuesday evenings for soccer practice and answered the phone when someone called and sat on the back steps in the gold light of a May evening and told the truth about what it noticed. Steady was the whole thing, if you let it be. Sophie looked up from her pasta and looked at the two of them and seemed to find what she was looking for. She went back to eating, satisfied, the way she did when she'd checked something she'd been tracking and confirmed it was where she thought it was. Outside, Portland moved through its evening in the rain, unremarkable and sufficient and full of people doing the work of their ordinary lives, most of them choosing, in 1,000 small ways, what kind of room they were going to be.